I think Greenleaf might be my favorite story from Flannery O'Connor. In this story, we meet Mrs. May, a good Christian woman with a large respect for religion, though she did not, of course, believe any of it was true. She's a widow who runs a dairy farm and harbors a deep resentment towards the Greenleaf family. The story intensifies when a bull belonging to the Greenleafs trespasses on her property. This bull is no ordinary bull. It symbolizes uncontrollable forces that she rejects, and divine intervention in which she does not believe. In this video, I will read the story in its entirety and pause on occasion for comment and analysis. As we read this story, keep an eye out for barriers, hedges, fences, tree lines, even the bars of light that are cast onto objects through Venetian blinds. This is Greenleaf by Flannery O'Connor.
Mrs. May's bedroom window was low and faced on the east, and the bull, silvered in the moonlight, stood under it, his head raised as if he listened, like some patient god come down to woo her, for a stir inside the room. The window was dark and the sound of her breathing too light to be carried outside. Clouds crossed the moon, blackening him, and in the dark he began to tear at the hedge. Presently they passed, and he appeared again in the same spot, chewing steadily, with a hedge wreath that he had ripped loose for himself caught in the tips of his horns. When the moon drifted into retirement again, there was nothing to mark his place but the sound of steady chewing. Then abruptly a pink glow filled the window. Bars of light slid across him as the Venetian blind was slit. He took a step backward and lowered his head as if to show the wreath across his horns. For almost a minute there was no sound from inside. Then, as he raised his crowned head again, a woman's voice, guttural as if addressed to a dog, said, "Get away from here, sir," and in the second muttered, "Some scrub bull." The animal pawed the ground, and Mrs. May, standing bent forward behind the blind, closed it quickly, lest the light make him charge into the shrubbery. For a second she waited, still bent forward, her nightgown hanging loosely from her narrow shoulders. Green rubber curlers sprouted neatly over her forehead, and her face beneath them was smooth as concrete with an egg-white paste that drew the wrinkles out while she slept.
In these paragraphs, there is a significant shift in point of view, a really important one. As the story opens, we are outside the house. We see the bedroom window, the hedge, and the bull silvered in the moonlight. Eventually, a part of the hedge gets caught in the bull's horns, forming a wreath, like some patient god come down to woo her. With the wreath on his head, the description, and that simile like a god. From this point of view, the bull clearly represents a Greek god in the form of a bull. Which Greek god would do this? Well, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, there is a story called the Rape of Europa, in which Zeus turns himself into a bull in order to seduce Europa. Still, from outside the house, we hear a voice. Mrs. May doesn't see a god. And this is key. The story is all about what Mrs. May doesn't see. The next paragraph begins inside the house and goes back in time just a little.
She had been conscious in her sleep of a steady rhythmic chewing as if something were eating one wall of the house. She had been aware that whatever it was had been eating as long as she had had the place, and had eaten everything from the beginning of her fence line up to the house, and now was eating the house, and calmly, with the same steady rhythm, would continue through the house, eating her and the boys, and then on, eating everything but the Greenleafs, on, eating everything until nothing was left but the Greenleafs, on a little island all their own in the middle of what had been her place. When the munching reached her elbow, she jumped up and found herself fully awake, standing in the middle of her room. She identified the sound at once. A cow was tearing at the shrubbery under the window. Mr. Greenleaf had left the lane gate open, and she didn't doubt that the entire herd was on her lawn. She turned on the dim pink table lamp, and then went to the window and slit the blind. The bull, gaunt and long-legged, was standing about 4 feet from her, chewing calmly like an uncouth country suitor.
This paragraph is from the point of view inside the room. Mrs. May has been dreaming, and the munching of the bull became a part of her dream. It was bent on having all that is hers. That's important, so hold that in your head. Then we have a very telling comment. She knew two things with absolute certainty. One, that a cow was at the hedge, and two, that this was because Mr. Greenleaf had left the gate open. We already know that she is mistaken on point number one. It's not a cow. And this error suggests that we should be a little skeptical about point number two. But she goes on a bit of a mental rampage against Mr. Greenleaf anyway. One more thing. When she eventually looks at the bull, she doesn't see the Greek god. She sees someone as far from that as you can get. An uncouth country suitor. She sees things very differently. So pull back and look at this situation. We have a girl who is looking out of a window, and a boy just called a suitor, standing outside the window looking up at it. What do we have? Romeo and Juliet. She doesn't think too much of this Romeo. But let's look at the description of our Juliet. With her nightgown hanging loosely from her shoulders, green rubber curlers sprouting neatly over her forehead, and her face beneath them was smooth as concrete with an egg-white paste. Yeesh.
For 15 years, she thought as she squinted at him fiercely, she had been having shiftless people's hogs root up her oats, their mules wallow on her lawn, their scrub bulls breed her cows. If this one was not put up now, he would be over the fence ruining her herd before morning. And Mr. Greenleaf was soundly sleeping a half-mile down the road in the tenant house. There was no way to get him unless she dressed and got in the car and rode down there and woke him up. He would come, but his expression, his whole figure, his every pause would say, "It looks to me like one or both of them boys would not make their maw ride out in the middle of the night this-a-way. If hit was my boys, they would have got the bull up theirself." The bull lowered his head and shook it, and the wreath slipped down to the base of his horns, where it looked like a menacing, prickly crown. She had closed the blinds then. In a few seconds she heard him move off heavily.
What happened to our Greek god? Our Zeus. The wreath slipped on him, and it became a menacing, prickly crown. Still a god, but now the bull is Jesus. So let's summarize. The bull starts off as Zeus, but it's also Jesus, and he wants everything that is hers, and she just sees a scrub bull, or in metaphoric terms, a wooing hick. The bull needs to be dealt with, but Mrs. May doesn't want to go get Mr. Greenleaf. She doesn't want to deal with what she thinks he will think. What do psychologists call it when someone projects their own unwanted feelings or traits onto another person, and then reacts to the other person as if they genuinely possess those feelings or traits? Projective identification?
Mr. Greenleaf would say, "If it was my boys, they would never have allowed their ma to go after hired help in the middle of the night. They would have did it theirself." Weighing it, she decided not to bother Mr. Greenleaf. She returned to bed thinking that if the Greenleaf boys had risen in the world, it was because she had given their father employment when no one else would have him. She had had Mr. Greenleaf 15 years, but no one else would have had him 5 minutes. Just the way he approached an object was enough to tell anybody with eyes what kind of a worker he was. He walked with a high-shouldered creep, and he never appeared to come directly forward. He walked on the perimeter of some invisible circle, and if you wanted to look him in the face, you had to move and get in front of him. She had not fired him because she always doubted she could do better. He was too shiftless to go out and look for another job. He didn't have the initiative to steal, and after she had told him 3 or 4 times to do a thing, he did it. But he never told her about a sick cow until it was too late to call the veterinarian. And if her barn caught fire, he would have called his wife to see the flames before he began to put them out. And of the wife, she didn't even like to think. Besides the wife, Mr. Greenleaf was an aristocrat. "If it had been my boys," he would have said, "they would have cut off their right arm before they would have allowed their ma to." "If your boys had any pride, Mr. Greenleaf," she would like to say to him someday, "there are many things that they would not allow their mother to do."
We learn that the Greenleaf boys have risen in the world, and she takes the credit for that. She obviously can't stand Mr. Greenleaf, and she counts all the ways. Let's just look at a few of the things on her list. He's shiftless. Her evidence for this is that he hasn't left her for another job. Isn't there another name for a person that sticks with something or someone without quitting? And did you notice that he doesn't steal from her? She acknowledges this and then attributes it to a lack of initiative. Wow! I've raised cattle and there are reasons to call a vet for a sick cow. But there are also reasons not to. The real farmer knows the difference. Oh, and she's got huge issues with Mrs. Greenleaf. More on that later. O'Connor's structuring of exposition is brilliant.
The next morning, as soon as Mr. Greenleaf came to the back door, she told him there was a stray bull on the place and that she wanted him penned up at once. "Done already been here 3 days, he said, addressing his right foot, which he held forward, turned slightly as if he were trying to look at the sole. He was standing at the bottom of the 3 back steps, while she leaned out of the kitchen door, a small woman with pale nearsighted eyes, and gray hair that rose on top like the crest of some disturbed bird.
3 days, she said in the restrained screech that had become habitual with her.
Mr. Greenleaf, looking into the distance over the near pasture, removed a package of cigarettes from his shirt pocket and let one fall into his hand. He put the package back and stood for a while looking at the cigarette. "I put him in the bullpen, but he tore out of there," he said presently. "I didn't see him none after that." He bent over the cigarette and lit it, and then turned his head briefly in her direction. The upper part of his face sloped gradually into the lower, which was long and narrow, shaped like a rough chalice. He had deep-set fox-colored eyes shadowed under a gray felt hat that he wore slanted forward following the line of his nose. His build was insignificant. "Mr. Greenleaf," she said, "get that bull up this morning before you do anything else. You know he'll ruin the breeding schedule. Get him up and keep him up. And the next time there's a stray bull in this place, tell me at once. Do you understand?" "Where you want him put at?" Mr. Greenleaf asked. "I don't care where you put him," she said. "You are supposed to have some sense. Put him where he can't get out." "Whose bull is he?" For a moment Mr. Greenleaf seemed to hesitate between silence and speech. He studied the air to the left of him. "He must be somebody's bull," he said after a while. "Yes, he must," she said, and shut the door with a precise little slam. She went into the dining room where the boys were eating breakfast, and sat down on the edge of her chair at the head of the table. She never ate breakfast, but she sat with them to see that they had what they wanted. "Honestly," she said, and she began to tell about the bull, aping Mr. Greenleaf, saying, "It must be somebody's bull." Wesley continued to read the newspaper folded beside his plate, but Scofield interrupted his eating from time to look at her and laugh. The two boys never had the same reaction to anything. They were as different, she said, as night and day. The only thing they did have in common was neither of them cared what happened on the place. Scofield was a business type, and Wesley was an intellectual. Wesley, the younger child, had had rheumatic fever when he was 7, and Mrs. May thought that this was what had caused him to be an intellectual. Scofield, who had never had a day's sickness in his life, was an insurance salesman. She would not have minded his selling insurance if he had sold a nicer kind, but he sold the kind that only Negroes buy. He was what the Negroes called a policy man. He said there was more money in insurance than any other kind. Before company, he was very loud about it. He would shout, "Mama don't like to hear me say it, but I'm the best insurance salesman in this county." Scofield was 36, and he had a broad, pleasant face, but he was not married. "Yes," Mrs. May would say, "and if you sold decent insurance, some nice girl would be willing to marry you. What nice girl wants to marry an insurance salesman? You'll wake up some day and it'll be too late." At this, Scofield would yodel and say, "Why, Mama, I'm not going to marry until you're dead and gone, and then I'm going to marry me some nice fat girl that can take over this place." And once he had added, "some nice lady like Mrs. Greenleaf." When he had said this, Mrs. May had risen from her chair, her back stiff as a rake handle, and had gone to her room. There she had sat down on the edge of her bed for some time with her small face drawn. Finally she had whispered, "I work and slave, I struggle and sweat to keep this place for them, and as soon as I'm dead they'll marry trash and bring it in here and ruin everything. They'll marry trash and ruin everything I've done." And she had made up her mind at that moment to change her will. The next day she had gone to her lawyer and had had the property entailed so that if they married, they could not leave it to their wives.
Mrs. May has 2 sons, and she says they were as different as night and day. But she's wrong. They are very much alike. They are both critical, dismissive, entitled, selfish, ungrateful, and unmotivated. The difference is that Scofield is all these things with a mocking grin, and Wesley with a surly sneer. Wesley and Scofield are quite something. No wonder. Look who raised them. Symbolically, they embody some of the themes of modern secularism, namely the erosion of traditional values and the lack of spirituality. The May boys are in their 30s. They live at home and are unmarried. There is a decided sense of sterility or barrenness about this family. This is in sharp contrast with the Greenleafs. Yes, and that name is symbolic. Did you notice that the Greenleafs have 7 children? Mrs. May has 2.
The idea that one of them might marry a woman even remotely like Mrs. Greenleaf was enough to make her ill. She had put up with Mr. Greenleaf for 15 years, but the only way she had endured his wife had been by keeping entirely out of her sight. Mrs. Greenleaf was large and loose. The yard around her house looked like a dump, and her 5 girls were always filthy. Even the youngest one dipped snuff. Instead of making a garden or washing their clothes, her preoccupation was what she called prayer healing. Every day she'd cut all the morbid stories out of the newspaper, the accounts of women who had been raped, and criminals who had escaped, and children who had been burned, and of train wrecks and plane crashes and the divorces of movie stars. She took these to the woods and dug a hole and buried them, and then she fell on the ground over them and mumbled and groaned for an hour or so, moving her huge arms back and forth under her and out again, and finally just lying down flat. And Mrs. May suspected going to sleep in the dirt. She had not found this out until the Greenleafs had been with her a few months. One morning she had been out to inspect a field that she wanted planted in rye, but that had come up in clover because Mr. Greenleaf had used the wrong seeds in the grain drill. She was returning through a wooded path that separated 2 pastures, muttering to herself and hitting the ground methodically, with a long stick that she carried in case she saw a snake. "Mr. Greenleaf," she was saying in a low voice, "I cannot afford to pay for your mistakes. I am a poor woman, and this place is all I have. I have 2 boys to educate. I cannot—" Out of nowhere, a guttural, agonized voice groaned, "Jesus, Jesus!" In a second, it came again with a terrible urgency, "Jesus, Jesus!" Mrs. May stopped still, one hand lifted to her throat. The sound was so piercing that she felt as if some violent, unleashed force had broken out of the ground and was charging toward her. Her second thought was more reasonable. Somebody had been hurt on the place and would sue her for everything she had. She had no insurance. She rushed forward, and turning a bend in the path, she saw Mrs. Greenleaf sprawled on her hands and knees, off the side of the road, her head down. "Mrs. Greenleaf!" she shrilled. "What's happened?" Mrs. Greenleaf raised her head. Her face was a patchwork of dirt and tears, and her small eyes, the color of 2 field peas, were red-rimmed and swollen, but her expression was as composed as a bulldog's. She swayed back and forth on her hands and knees and groaned, "Jesus, Jesus." Mrs. May winced. She thought the word Jesus should be kept inside the church building, like other words inside the bedroom. She was a good Christian woman with a large respect for religion, though she did not, of course, believe any of it was true. "What's the matter with you?" she asked sharply. "You broke my heelin'," Mrs. Greenleaf said, waving her aside. "I can't talk to you until I finish." Mrs. May stood, bent forward, her mouth open and her stick raised off the ground as if she were not sure what she wanted to strike with it. "Oh, Jesus, stab me in the heart," Mrs. Greenleaf shrieked. "Jesus, stab me in the heart!" And she fell flat back in the dirt, a huge human mound, her legs and arms spread out as if she were trying to wrap them around the earth. Mrs. May felt as furious and helpless as if she had been insulted by a child. "Jesus," she said, drawing herself back, "would be ashamed of you. He would tell you to get up from there this instant and go wash your children's clothes." And she had turned and walked off as fast as she could. Whenever she thought of how the Greenleaf boys had advanced in the world, she had only to think of Mrs. Greenleaf sprawled obscenely on the ground and say to herself, "Well, no matter how far they go, they came from that."
You can see what Mrs. May obviously values. Externally clean children who don't chew tobacco. Mrs. Greenleaf is the foil of Mrs. May. Through the voice of the narrator, Mrs. May provides several points of comparison that illustrate her superiority over the other woman. But there's a lot more that she misses on the level of the symbolic and the spiritual, where Mrs. Greenleaf comes out on top. The key difference is that Mrs. May rejects Christian spirituality. Consistent with modern secular notions, God doesn't exist, or if he does, he's irrelevant. Fine, be religious, but keep it inside the walls of the church. Mrs. Greenleaf is spiritual. She's passionate in her prayers. She believes that God hears her and will respond. She prays for everyone, even perfect strangers, and she does it outside. When I read this passage about Mrs. Greenleaf's prayer healing for the first time, I thought that O'Connor was being critical of some extreme forms or practices of Christianity in her Southern context. I was wrong. Mrs. Greenleaf's behavior may be a little extreme, but O'Connor is presenting us with a woman who is extreme in the sincerity of her belief, and in her devotion to God, and her care for others. Mrs. May cares for none of these things, and it is of Mrs. May that O'Connor is critical. There's much to be learned from this contrast. This would be a great sermon illustration for any preachers who have stumbled into this story. Let me just briefly touch on 2 other particulars. She had been out to inspect a field that she had wanted to plant in rye, but that had come up in clover because Mr. Greenleaf had used the wrong seeds in the grain drill. If you read this story carefully, you will find a lot of clues like this one, that Mr. Greenleaf runs the farm and makes all the important decisions, and Mrs. May does nothing but boss him around and complain all the time. He planted the clover deliberately. Clover will replenish the soil that has had rye in it. Rye is a nitrogen pig. Mr. Greenleaf did the right thing. She told him to do the wrong thing. She has no idea how much she is indebted to Mr. Greenleaf. She is blind to this reality. Last thing, Mrs. Greenleaf says, "Jesus, Jesus." The sound was so piercing that Mrs. May felt as if some violent unleashed force had broken out of the ground and was charging toward her. There is power in the name of Jesus. And the metaphor that's used to describe that power is like a charging bull.
She would like to have been able to put in her will that when she died, Wesley and Scofield were not to continue to employ Mr. Greenleaf. She was capable of handling Mr. Greenleaf. They were not. Mr. Greenleaf had pointed out to her once that her boys didn't know hay from silage. She had pointed out to him that they had other talents, that Scofield was a successful businessman, and Wesley a successful intellectual. Mr. Greenleaf did not comment, but he never lost an opportunity of letting her see, by his expression or some simple gesture, that he held the two of them in infinite contempt. As scrub-human as the Greenleafs were, he never hesitated to let her know that in any like circumstances in which his own boys might have been involved, they, O.T. and E.T. Greenleaf, would have acted to better advantage.
The Greenleaf boys were 2 or 3 years younger than the May boys.
They were twins, and you never knew when you spoke to one of them whether you were speaking to O.T. or E.T., and they never had the politeness to enlighten you. They were long-legged and raw-boned and red-skinned with bright, grasping, fox-colored eyes like their fathers. Mr. Greenleaf's pride in them began with the fact that they were twins. He acted, Mrs. May said, as if this were something smart they had thought of themselves. They were energetic and hard-working, and she would admit to anyone that they had come a long way, and that the Second World War was responsible for it. They had both joined the service, and disguised in their uniforms they could not be told from other people's children. You could tell, of course, when they opened their mouths, but they did that seldom. The smartest thing they had done was to get sent overseas and there to marry French wives. They hadn't married French trash either. They had married nice girls who naturally couldn't tell they murdered the king's English, or that the Greenleafs were who they were. Wesley's heart condition had not permitted him to serve his country, but Scofield had been in the army for 2 years. He had not cared for it, and at the end of his military service, he was only a private first class. The Greenleaf boys were both some kind of sergeants, and Mr. Greenleaf in those days had never lost an opportunity of referring to them by their rank. They had both managed to get wounded, and now they both had pensions. Further, as soon as they were released from the army, they took advantage of all the benefits and went to the School of Agriculture at the university, the taxpayers meanwhile supporting their French wives. The two of them were now living about 2 miles down the highway on a piece of land that the government had helped them to buy, in a brick duplex bungalow that the government had helped them to build and pay for. If the war had made anyone, Mrs. May said it had made the Greenleaf boys. They each had 3 little children apiece who spoke Greenleaf English and French, and who, on account of their mother's background, would be sent to the convent school and brought up with manners. And in 20 years, Mrs. May asked Scofield and Wesley, do you know what those people will be? Society, she said blackly.
O'Connor's ability to pack so much into her writing never ceases to amaze me. One of the techniques that she uses to do all this work is called free indirect discourse. We talked about this in more depth in the video on O'Connor's short story, Revelation. It's basically when the voice and attitudes of a character come out in the words of the narrator. O'Connor uses this device in this story as well, especially in those last paragraphs. While the narrator was channeling Mrs. May's negative description of O.T. and E.T., we see how incredible the Greenleaf boys actually are, and what a pair of losers the May boys are, and a veiled attempt of Mrs. May to hide her own disappointment with her sons, and what a miserable crab she is. Mrs. May refers to the Greenleafs as scrub-human. They belong to a lower class than the one to which she belongs. To her, this is the essential difference between her boys and the Greenleaf boys. She's blind. She doesn't see that this is not the essential difference. We see it very clearly. O.T. and E.T. are hardworking and industrious. They embody traditional rural values such as strength, resilience, and a strong connection to the land. Their hard work and positive attitude is leading to prosperity and flourishing, like trees with green leaves. But it's not been all them. Mrs. May is quick to point out that luck played a large part in their success. Some people don't believe in luck, however. They accept that these things are part of a design. They're gifts from God, like sunlight is to green leaves. But that's not how Mrs. May sees it. The success of the Greenleaf boys accentuate the May family's dysfunction and stagnation. Mrs. May won't admit it to herself, but she envies the Greenleaf family's success and consequently resents them. But she's not aware of these feelings in herself. She's not very self-reflective.
She had spent 15 years coping with Mr. Greenleaf, and by now, handling him had become second nature with her. His disposition on any particular day was as much a factor in what she could and couldn't do as the weather was. And she had learned to read his face the way real country people read the sunrise and sunset. She was a countrywoman only by persuasion. The late Mr. May, a businessman, had bought the place when land was down. And when he died, it was all he had to leave her. The boys had not been happy to move out to the country to a broken-down farm, but there was nothing else for her to do. She had the timber on the place cut, and with the proceeds had set herself up in the dairy business after Mr. Greenleaf had answered her ad. "I seen your ad and I will come," have 2 boys, was all his letter said. But he arrived the next day in a pieced-together truck, his wife and 5 daughters sitting on the floor in the back, himself and the 2 boys in the cab. Over the years that they had been on her place, Mr. and Mrs. Greenleaf had hardly aged at all. They had no worries, no responsibilities. They lived like the lilies of the field, off the fat that she struggled to put into the land. When she was dead and gone from overwork and worry, the Greenleafs, healthy and thriving, would be just ready to begin draining Scofield and Wesley.
Mrs. May says that the Greenleafs lived like the lilies of the field. This is an allusion to a teaching of Jesus from Matthew 6:28-29. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Jesus tells us that we should live like the lilies of the field. Don't worry so much about what you're going to eat or wear, but trust God for everything. Mrs. May sees them living as instructed, and she sees their flourishing, but she still considers this approach to life as irresponsible. Ironically, the Greenleafs do a lot of work, and Mrs. May does very little. The lilies of the field bit is juxtaposed with the story of how Mrs. May came to be a dairy farmer. Her husband died and left her some land. She quite literally received this land through no direct action of her own. There were trees on this land that she did not plant. These produced enough cash to set herself up in the dairy business. And then, by a miracle, she did not even have to run the farm. Mr. Greenleaf shows up to do all the work. It sounds like she's got a lot to be thankful for. She's not thankful. Did you notice that from her perspective, the Greenleafs are living off the fat that she has struggled to put into the land? Apparently, it is by her work that the soil is fertile, and that the plants grow, and that the cattle multiply, etc. Through her will and work. Wow. The Greenleafs are parasites? She has been so blessed, and yet is filled with resentment. Have you ever met anyone like this? Sadly, they are not rare. Speaking of free and direct discourse, we've got a great example of it in the next paragraph. The sentiments of a mother attempting to excuse the obviously rude behavior of her son comes out in the words of the narrator.
Wesley said that the reason Mrs. Greenleaf had not aged was because she released all her emotions in prayer healing. "You ought to start praying, sweetheart," he said in the voice that, poor boy, he could not help making deliberately nasty. Scofield only exasperated her beyond endurance, but Wesley caused her real anxiety. He was thin and nervous and bald, and being an intellectual was a terrible strain on his disposition. She doubted if he would marry until she died, but she was certain that then the wrong woman would get him. Nice girls didn't like Scofield, but Wesley didn't like nice girls. He didn't like anything. He drove 20 miles every day to the university where he taught, and 20 miles back every night. But he said he hated the 20-mile drive, and he hated the second-rate university, and he hated the morons who attended it. He hated the country, and he hated the life he lived. He hated living with his mother and his idiot brother, and he hated hearing about the damn dairy and the damn help and the damn broken machinery. But in spite of all he said, he never made a move to leave. He talked about Paris and Rome, but he never went even to Atlanta. "You'd go to one of those places and you'd get sick," Mrs. May would say. "Who in Paris is going to see that you get a salt-free diet? And do you think if you married one of those odd numbers that you take out, that she would cook a salt-free diet for you? No, indeed, she would not." When she took this line, Wesley turned himself roughly round in his chair and ignored her. Once, when she had kept it up too long, he had snarled, "Well, why don't you do something practical, woman? Why don't you pray for me like Mrs. Greenleaf would?" "I don't like to hear you boys make jokes about religion," she had said. "If you would go to church, you would meet some nice girls." But it was impossible to tell them anything. When she looked at the two of them now, sitting on either side of the table, neither one caring the least if a stray bull ruined her herd, which was their herd, their future. When she looked at the two of them, one hunched over the paper, the other teetering back in his chair, grinning at her like an idiot, she wanted to jump up and beat her fists on the table and shout, "You'll find out one of these days. You'll find out what reality is when it's too late."
It's always interesting in O'Connor's stories when the character actually tells someone else the very thing that they need to hear. And one more thing. Did you notice why Mrs. May would like her boys to attend church? Not to meet God, to meet girls. God is the means to an end, rather than the end itself. That's never a good thing.
"Mama," Scofield said, "don't you get excited now, but I'll tell you whose bull that is." He was looking at her wickedly. He let his chair drop forward and he got up. Then, with his shoulders bent and his hands held up to cover his head, he tiptoed to the door. He backed into the hall and pulled the door almost to, so that it hid all of him but his face. "You want to know sugar pie?" he asked. Mrs. May sat looking at him coldly. "That's O.T. and E.T.'s bull," he said. "I collected from their nick yesterday. and he told me they were missing it. And he showed her an exaggerated expanse of teeth and disappeared silently. Wesley looked up and laughed. Mrs. May turned her head again, her expression unaltered. "Am I the only adult on this place?" she said. She leaned across the table and pulled the paper from the side of his plate. "Do you see how it's going to be when I die and you boys have to handle him?" she began. "Do you see why he didn't know whose bull that was? Because it was theirs. Do you see what I have to put up with? Do you see if I hadn't kept my foot on his neck all these years, you boys might be milking cows every morning at 4 o'clock? Wesley pulled the paper back toward his plate and stared at her full in the face. He murmured, "I wouldn't milk a cow to save your soul from hell." "I know you wouldn't," she said in a brittle voice. She sat back and began rapidly turning her knife over at the side of her plate. "O.T. and E.T. are fine boys," she said. "They ought to have been my sons." The thought of this was so horrible that her vision of Wesley was blurred at once by a wall of tears. All she saw was his dark shape, rising quickly from the table. "And you two," she cried. "You two should have belonged to that woman." He was heading for the door. "When I die," she said in a thin voice, "I don't know what's going to become of you." "You're always yapping about when you die," he growled as he rushed out, "but you look pretty healthy to me."
So there's quite a lot of family dynamics on display in this little breakfast scene. It's significant that all this happens at a meal, at a table. Every meal in literature or film is likely significant. When you get right down to it, meals are generally pretty boring. So a point is always being made when there's a meal. Meals symbolize a coming together. They are about relationship, communion. And sometimes, like this one, there's a lot of irony.
For some time she sat where she was, looking straight ahead through the window across the room into a scene of indistinct grays and greens. She stretched her face and her neck muscles and drew in a long breath, but the scene in front of her flowed together anyway into a watery gray mass. "They needn't think I'm going to die anytime soon," she muttered, and some more defiant voice in her added, "I'll die when I get good and ready." She wiped her eyes with the table napkin and got up and went to the window and gazed at the scene in front of her. The cows were grazing on 2 pale green pastures across the road, and behind them, fencing them in, was a black wall of trees with a sharp sawtooth edge that held off the indifferent sky. The pastures were enough to calm her. When she looked out of any window in her house, she saw a reflection of her own character. Her city friends said that she was the most remarkable woman they knew. To go practically penniless with no experience, out to a rundown farm and make a success of it. "Everything is against you," she would say. "The weather is against you, and the dirt is against you, and the help is against you. They're all in league against you. There's nothing for it but an iron hand." "Look at Mama's iron hand," Scofield would yell and grab her arm and hold it up so that her delicate blue-veined little hand would dangle from her wrist like the head of a broken lily. The company always laughed. The sun moving over the black and white grazing cows was just a little brighter than the rest of the sky. Looking down, she saw a darker shape that might have been its shadow cast at an angle, moving among them. She uttered a sharp cry and turned and marched out of the house.
"I'll die when I get good and ready?" It's clear through this story that Mrs. May believes that she bears a tremendous load upon her shoulders. Again, it's her delusion that she is in control of her life, as symbolized by being in control of what happens on the farm. She said it several times in several ways. In this last example, she is saying that she's even responsible for determining her own death. She's assuming the place of God, which is the place that we in the secular West usually assume when we deny his existence. She lives in a world where everything is against you, another common idea in the secular West. She names the weather, the dirt, and the help as her antagonists. But where would any farmer be without those things? Sun, rain, soil, and Mr. Greenleaf? These things are gifts, but she doesn't see it that way. And so she has absolutely no gratitude. She runs the place, her life, with an iron hand. But the metaphoric description of her actual hand shows the reality of the situation. It was a delicate, blue-veined little hand that would dangle from her wrist like the head of a broken lily. That's how much power she actually has. Okay, now things start getting really interesting. The way the setting is described here is packed with religious symbolism. Look at the picture O'Connor paints. The cows are in Mrs. May's pastures. There's a wall of trees that hold off the sky. Like the hedge around her house is a barrier to the bull. The wall of trees is another barrier between her land and the sky, which needs to be held off, like it wants to get in. And she says that this landscape is also an image of her character. Barriers everywhere. She sees the bull amongst the herd. That's not a good thing from a farming perspective. You want to use a good dairy bull so that the female offspring improve your herd. But the bull isn't just a bull. Remember the last time we talked about the bull symbolically? It was Jesus? In this passage, the bull looked like a shadow of the sun. The bull is a representation of the sun. If the bull is Jesus, then the Son is God from whom all blessings flow. The one who sent the bull from up there outside the trees into Mrs. May's land inside the trees. The bull being on this side of the tree line is like Christ who came from the realm of God and has entered the world of Mrs. May's farm. This is an image of the incarnation. Ooh, how's that going to play out?
Mr. Greenleaf was in the trench silo filling a wheelbarrow. She stood on the edge and looked down at him. "I told you to get up that bull. Now he's in with a milk herd." "You can't do two things at once," Mr. Greenleaf remarked. "I told you to do that first." He wheeled the barrow out of the open end of the trench toward the barn, and she followed close behind him. "And you needn't think, Mr. Greenleaf," she said, "that I don't know exactly whose bull that is, or why you haven't been in any hurry to notify me he was here. I might as well fed O.T. and E.T.'s bull as long as I'm going to have him here ruining my herd." Mr. Greenleaf paused with the wheelbarrow and looked behind him. "Is that them boys' bull?" he asked in an incredulous tone. She did not say a word. She merely looked away with her mouth taut. "They told me their bull was out, but I never known that was him," he said. "I want that bull put up now," she said. "And I'm going to drive over to O.T. and E.T.'s and tell them that they better come and get him today. I ought to charge them for the time he's been here. Then it wouldn't happen again." "They didn't pay but $75 for him," Mr. Greenleaf offered. "I wouldn't have had him as a gift," she said.
She says this proudly, but it's one of the things she criticizes her boys for. And it's a significant deficiency in her own character. She receives nothing as a gift. Another thing, we've been talking about control. Mrs. May thinks she's in control. She thinks she's in control of her farm, and she thinks she's going to control the bull. The Greenleaf boys symbolically do not try to control the bull. They realize it's out of their hands.
"They was just going to beef him," Mr. Greenleaf went on, "but he got loose and run his head into their pickup truck. He don't like cars and trucks. They had a time getting his horn out of the fender, and when they finally got him loose, he took off, and they was too tired to run after him. But I never known that was him there." "I wouldn't have paid you to know, Mr. Greenleaf," she said. "But you know now. Get a horse and get him." In a half an hour, from her front window, she saw the bull, squirrel-colored with jutting hips and long light horns, ambling down the dirt road that ran in front of the house. Mr. Greenleaf was behind him on the horse. "That's a Greenleaf bull if I ever saw one," she muttered. She went out onto the porch and called, "Put him where he can't get out." "He likes to bust loose," Mr. Greenleaf said, looking with approval at the bull's rump. "This gentleman is a sport." "If those boys don't come for him, he's going to be a dead sport," she said. "I'm just warning you." He heard her, but he didn't answer. "That's the awfulest bull I ever saw," she called, but he was too far down the road to hear. It was mid-morning when she turned into O.T. and E.T.'s driveway. The house, a new brick low-to-the-ground building that looked like a warehouse with windows, was on top of a treeless hill. The sun was beating down directly on the white roof of it. It was the kind of house that everybody built now, and nothing marked it as belonging to the Greenleafs except 3 dogs, part hound and part Spitz, that rushed out from behind it as soon as she stopped her car. She reminded herself that she could always tell the class of people by the class of dog, and honked her horn. While she sat waiting for someone to come, she continued to study the house. All the windows were down, and she wondered if the government could have air-conditioned the thing. No one came, and she honked again. Presently the door opened and several children appeared in it and stood looking at her. Making no move to come forward, she recognized this as a true Greenleaf trait. They could hang in a door looking at you for hours.
Is it a true May trait to pull into someone's drive and honk the horn and expect them to come out to you? You will recall that earlier, when Mrs. May looked out the window over at her place, there were the trees that held off the sky, and the sun was just a little brighter than the rest of the sky. Just a few miles away at the farm of the Greenleaf boys, we have a whole different thing. There are no trees. Their house sat on the top of a treeless hill. And the sun, it's beating down on the roof of the house. The Greenleafs are basking in the providence of God. We can get a little biological here. Green leaves are designed to absorb and use the energy of the sun, and that's what the Greenleafs are doing. The Mays are indifferent to the sun. Their farm is basically sunless, symbolically.
"Can one of you children come here?" she called. After a minute, they all began to move forward, slowly. They had on overalls and were barefoot, but they were not as dirty as she might have expected. There were 2 or 3 that looked distinctly like Greenleafs, the others not so much so. The smallest child was a girl with untidy black hair. They stopped about 6 feet from the automobile and stood looking at her. "You're mighty pretty," Mrs. May said, addressing herself to the smallest girl. There was no answer. They appeared to share one dispassionate expression between them. "Where's your mama?" she asked. There was no answer to this for some time. Then one of them said something in French. Mrs. May did not speak French. "Where's your daddy?" she asked. After a while, one of the boys said, "He ain't hyar neither." "Ah," Mrs. May said, as if something had been proven. Where's the colored man? She waited and decided that no one was going to answer. The cat has 6 little tongues, she said. How would you like to come home with me and let me teach you how to talk? She laughed, and her laugh died on the silent air. She felt as if she were on trial for her life, facing a jury of Greenleafs. I'll go down and see if I can find the colored man, she said. You can go if you want to, one of the boys said. Well, thank you, she murmured and drove off. The barn was down the lane from the house. She had not seen it before, but Mr. Greenleaf had described it in detail, for it had been built according to the latest specifications. It was a milking parlor arrangement where the cows are milked from below. The milk ran in pipes from the machines to the milk house and was never carried in no bucket, Mr. Greenleaf said, by no human hand. When you going to get you one? He had asked. Mr. Greenleaf, she had said, I have to do for myself. I am not assisted hand and foot by the government. It would cost me $20,000 to install a milking parlor. I barely make ends meet as it is. My boy's done it, Mr. Greenleaf had murmured, and then, but all boys ain't alike. No, indeed, she had said. I thank God for that. I thank God for everything, Mr. Greenleaf had drawled. You might as well, she had thought in the fierce silence that followed. You have never done anything for yourself.
Mrs. May uses the cliché, I thank God for that, in a very unpleasant way. Mr. Greenleaf is actually being serious. He literally thanks God for everything. This underscores what we've been saying about what's behind the flourishing of the Greenleafs. They receive everything as a gift, and then they are grateful to the giver of these gifts. We also have another recurrence of Mrs. May's attitude that the Greenleafs do nothing. You might as well thank God because you've never done anything yourself, she thinks. We just left Mr. Greenleaf hauling silage.
She stopped by the side of the barn and honked, but no one appeared. For several minutes she sat in the car, observing the various machines parked around, wondering how many of them were paid for. They had a forage harvester and a rotary hay baler. She had those too. She decided that since no one was here, she would get out and have a look at the milking parlor, and see if they kept it clean. She opened the milking room door and stuck her head in, and for the first second she felt as if she were going to lose her breath. The spotless white concrete room was filled with sunlight that came from a row of windows head-high along both walls. The metal stanchions gleamed ferociously, and she had to squint to be able to look at all. She drew her head out of the room quickly and closed the door and leaned against it, frowning. The light outside was not so bright, but she was conscious that the sun was directly on top of her head, like a silver bullet ready to drop into her brain.
She gets out of the car to go have a look at the milking parlor, for the sole purpose of judging the Greenleafs. She is disappointed. It's very clean and there's a lot of reflected sun in there. More of God's blessings. And now the sun is associated with penetration for the first time. A bit of a violent image, eh?
A Negro carrying a yellow calf feed bucket appeared from around the corner of the machine shed and came toward her. He was a light yellow boy dressed in the cast-off army clothes of the Greenleaf twins. He stopped at a respectable distance and set the bucket on the ground. Where's Mr. O.T. and Mr. E.T., she asked. Mr. O.T., he in town. Mr. E.T., he off yonder in the field, the Negro said, pointing first to the left and then to the right as if he were naming the positions of 2 planets. Can you remember a message, she asked, looking as if she thought this doubtful. I'll remember it if I don't forget it, he had said with a touch of sullenness. Well, I'll write it down then, she said, and she got into her car and took a stub of a pencil from her pocketbook and began to write on the back of an empty envelope. The Negro came and stood by the window. I'm Mrs. May, she said as she wrote. Their bull is on my place and I want him off today. You can tell them I'm furious about it. That bull left here Saturday, the Negro said, and none of us ain't seen him since. We ain't knowed where he was. Well, you know now, she said. And you can tell Mr. O.T. and Mr. E.T. that if they don't come and get him today, I'm going to have their daddy shoot him the first thing in the morning. I can't have that bull ruining my herd. And she handed him the note. If I know Mr. O.T. and Mr. E.T., he said, taking it, they go and say go ahead on and shoot him. He done busted up one of our trucks already, and we'd be glad to see the last of him. She pulled her head back and gave him a look from slightly bleared eyes. Do they expect me to take my time and my worker to shoot their bull? She asked. They don't want him, so they just let him loose and expect somebody else to kill him? He's eating my oats and ruining my herd, and I'm expected to shoot him too? I spec you is, he said softly. He done busted up. She gave him a very sharp look and said, well, I'm not surprised. That's just the way some people are. And after a second she asked, which is boss, Mr. O.T. or Mr. E.T.? She had always suspected they fought between themselves secretly. They never quarrels, the boy said. They like one man and 2 skins. I expect you just never heard them quarrel. Nor nobody else heard them neither, he said, looking away as if this insolence were addressed to someone else. Well, she said, I haven't put up with their father for 15 years not to know a few things about Greenleafs. The Negro looked at her suddenly with a gleam of recognition. "Is you my policy man's mother?" he asked. "I don't know who your policy man is," she said sharply. "You give them that note and tell them if they don't come for that bull today, they'll be making their father shoot it tomorrow." And she drove off.
With beef prices as they are, if someone offered me a whole bull and all I had to do was get it cut and wrapped, I would be very grateful. But this is a feeling that Mrs. May has never experienced. In the next scene, we are back around the table with Mrs. May and her sons. These guys are both over the age of 30. They still live at home. Women don't like them for various reasons. They have lousy jobs. They are not flourishing. Watch for more comparisons between these two sets of brothers.
She stayed at home all afternoon waiting for the Greenleaf twins to come for the bull. They did not come. I might as well be working for them, she thought furiously. They are simply going to use me to the limit. At the supper table, she went over it again for the boys' benefit because she wanted them to see exactly what O.T. and E.T. would do. "They don't want that bull," she said. "Pass the butter." "So they simply turn him loose and let somebody else worry about getting rid of him for them. How do you like that? I'm the victim. I've always been the victim." "Pass the butter to the victim," Wesley said. He was in a worse humor than usual because he had had a flat tire on the way home from the university. Scofield handed her the butter and said, "Why, Mama, ain't you ashamed to shoot an old bull that ain't done nothing but give you a little scrub strain in your herd?" "I declare," he said, "with the mama I got, it's a wonder I turned out to be such a nice boy." "You ain't her boy, son," Wesley said. She eased back in her chair, her fingertips on the edge of the table. "All I know is," Scofield said, "I done mighty well to be as nice as I am, seeing what I come from." When they teased her, they spoke Greenleaf English, but Wesley made his own particular tone come through it like a knife edge. "Well, let me tell you one thing, brother," he said, leaning over the table, "that if you had half a mind, you would already know." "What's that, brother?" Scofield asked, his broad face grinning into the thin, constricted one across from him. "That is," Wesley said, "that neither you nor me is her boy." But he stopped abruptly as she gave a kind of hoarse wheeze like an old horse lashed unexpectedly. She reared up and ran from the room. "Oh, for God's sake," Wesley growled, "what did you start her off for?" "I never started her off. You started her off." "Ha! She's not as young as she used to be, and she can't take it." "She can only give it out," Wesley said. "I'm the one that takes it." His brother's pleasant face had changed so that an ugly family resemblance showed between them. "Nobody feels sorry for a lousy bastard like you," he said, and he grabbed across the table at the other's shirt front. From her room she heard a crash of dishes and she rushed back through the kitchen into the dining room. The hall door was open and Scofield was going out of it. Wesley was lying like a large bug on his back, with the edge of the overturned table cutting him across the middle and broken dishes scattered on top of him. She pulled the table off him and caught up his arm to help him rise, but he scrambled up and pushed her off him in a furious charge of energy and flung himself out the door after his brother.
Again, we see how Mrs. May fills her day with all the work that she imagines that she does. She stayed at home all afternoon waiting. We are given no activity that occupies her during that afternoon. Her only action is passive. She waits. We heard earlier that the Greenleaf boys never fight. Not only that, they are twins, and they are joined in a common agricultural venture. They come together to form one collaborative family. In contrast, the May family is very dysfunctional. Around the dining room table, the symbol of coming together and communion, the family breaks up even further. The May approach to life drives a wedge between the members of the family. They even cruelly joke that they're not even related to each other. And a note about Mrs. May being a victim. Her boys, too, seem to think they are victims. I'm not saying that there is no such thing as victims. But people like the Mays who have a victim mentality can't see that it's a product of their own worldview. It's a byproduct of a view that negates gratitude. Mrs. May has had some significant difficulty in her life, as have the Greenleafs. They just receive suffering in very different ways.
She would have collapsed, but a knock at the door stiffened her and she swung around. Across the kitchen and back porch, she could see Mr. Greenleaf peering eagerly through the screen wire. All her resources returned in full strength as she had only needed to be challenged by the devil himself to regain them. "I heard a thump," he called. "I thought the plastering might have fell on you." If he had been wanted, somebody would have had to go on a horse to find him. She crossed the kitchen and the porch and stood inside the screen and said, "No, nothing happened, but the table turned over. One of the legs was weak." And without pausing, "The boys didn't come for the bull, so tomorrow you'll have to shoot him." The sky was crossed with thin red and purple bars, and behind them the sun was moving down slowly as if it were descending a ladder. Mr. Greenleaf squatted on the step, his back to her, the top of his hat on level with her feet. "Tomorrow I'll drive him home for you," he said. "Oh, no, Mr. Greenleaf," she said in a mocking voice. "You can drive him home tomorrow, and the next week he'll be back here. I know better than that." Then in a mournful tone she said, I'm surprised at OT and ET to treat me this way. I thought they'd have more gratitude. Those boys spent some mighty happy days on this place, didn't they, Mr. Greenleaf? Mr. Greenleaf didn't say anything. I think they did, she said. I think they did. But they've forgotten all the nice little things I did for them now. If I recall, they wore my boys' old clothes and played with my boys' old toys and hunted with my boys' old guns. They swam in my pond and shot my birds and fished in my stream. And I never forgot their birthday, and Christmas seemed to roll around very often if I remember it right. And do they think of any of those things now? She asked. No, she said.
Did you notice that the sky was crossed with thin red and purple bars? And behind them the sun was moving down slowly as if it were descending a ladder? Another barrier between the sun and Mrs. May. Just the way she likes it. I like this bit where she lists all the things that she did for the Greenleaf boys. Pretty meager stuff. She expects gratitude from the Greenleafs for virtually nothing. That's a little hypocritical, don't you think? In this next bit, notice how the sun has disappeared behind the tree line.
For a few seconds she looked at the disappearing sun, and Mr. Greenleaf examined the palms of his hands. Presently, as if it had just occurred to her, she asked, "Do you know the real reason they didn't come for that bull?" "No, I don't," Mr. Greenleaf said in a surly voice. "They didn't come because I'm a woman," she said. "You can get away with anything when you're dealing with a woman. If there were a man running this place..." Quick as a snake striking, Mr. Greenleaf said, "You got two boys. They know you got two men on the place." The sun had disappeared behind the tree line. She looked down at the dark, crafty face, upturned now, and at the wary eyes, bright under the shadow of the hat brim. She waited long enough for him to see that she was hurt, and then she said, "Some people learn gratitude too late, Mr. Greenleaf, and some never learn it at all." And she turned and left him sitting on the steps. Half the night in her sleep she heard a sound as if some large stone were grinding a hole on the outside wall of her brain. She was walking on the inside over a succession of beautiful rolling hills, planting her stick in front of each step. She became aware after a time that the noise was the sun trying to burn through the tree line, and she stopped to watch, safe in the knowledge that it couldn't, that it had to sink the way it always did outside of her property. When she first stopped, it was a swollen red ball, but as she stood watching, it began to narrow and pale until it looked like a bullet. Then suddenly it burst through the tree line and raced down the hill toward her. She woke up with her hand over her mouth, and the same noise, diminished but distinct, in her ear. It was the bull munching under her window. Mr. Greenleaf had let him out. She got up and made her way to the window in the dark and looked out through the slit blind. But the bull had moved away from the hedge, and at first she didn't see him. Then she saw a heavy form some distance away, paused as if observing her. "This is the last night I'm going to put up with this," she said, and watched until the iron shadow moved away in the darkness.
Mrs. May is dreaming again, and in her dream the sun is trying to get at her. But she is confident in her barriers. The trees will protect her. The sun cannot get near her. She is the master of her domain. Then it turns into a nightmare, and the sun turns into a bullet just like before, and it bursts through the trees and races downhill toward her. That last bit doesn't really sound like the actions of a bullet, does it? More like a bull. Cut to the bull chomping on her hedge, and then she speaks some words through which she exerts her control, and she doesn't know they're prophetic. "This is the last night I'm going to put up with this."
The next morning she waited until exactly 11 o'clock, and then she got in her car and she drove to the barn. Mr. Greenleaf was cleaning milk cans. He had 7 of them standing up outside the milk room to get the sun. She had been telling him to do this for 2 weeks. "All right, Mr. Greenleaf," she said. "Go get your gun. We're going to shoot that bull." "I thought you wanted these here cans." "Go get your gun, Mr. Greenleaf," she said. Her voice and her face were expressionless. "That gentleman tore out of there last night," he murmured in a tone of regret and bent again to the can he had his arm in. "Go get your gun, Mr. Greenleaf," she said in the same triumphant, toneless voice. "The bull is in the pasture with the dry cows. I saw him from my upstairs window. I'm going to drive you up to the field and you can run him into the empty pasture and shoot him there." He detached himself from the can slowly. "Ain't nobody ever asked me to shoot my boy's own bull," he said in a high, rasping voice. He removed a rag from his back pocket and began to wipe his hands violently, and then his nose. She turned as if she had not heard this and said, "I'll wait for you in the car. Go get your gun."
2 things of significance here. Mr. Greenleaf is cleaning 7 milk cans. The number 7 holds profound significance in the Bible, symbolizing completeness, perfection, and divine order. The act of cleaning 7 milk cans could symbolize a process of purification or preparation for something that is to come. Second thing, Mr. Greenleaf removed a rag from his back pocket and began to wipe his hands violently. Mr. Greenleaf is washing his hands just before he goes off and kills the symbol of Jesus Christ. You know who does the same thing just before he kills the real Jesus? Pontius Pilate.
She sat in the car and watched him stalk off toward the harness room where he kept a gun. After he had entered the room, there was a crash as if he had kicked something out of his way. Presently he emerged again with the gun, circled behind the car, opened the door violently, and threw himself into the seat beside her. He held the gun between his knees and looked straight ahead. He'd like to shoot me instead of the bull, she thought, and turned her face away so that he could not see her smile. The morning was dry and clear. She drove through the woods for a quarter of a mile and then out into the open, where there were fields on either side of the narrow road. The exhilaration of carrying her point had sharpened her senses. Birds were screaming everywhere. The grass was almost too bright to look at. The sky was an even piercing blue. "Spring is here," she said gaily. Mr. Greenleaf lifted one muscle somewhere near his mouth as if he found this the most asinine remark ever made. When she stopped at the second pasture gate, he flung himself out of the car door and slammed it behind him. Then he opened the gate and she drove through. He closed it and flung himself back in, silently, and she drove around the rim of the pasture until she spotted the bull, almost in the center of it, grazing peacefully among the cows. "The gentleman is waiting on you," she said, and gave Mr. Greenleaf's furious profile a sly look. "Run him into the next pasture, and when you get him in, I'll drive in behind you and shut the gate myself." He flung himself out again, this time deliberately leaving the car door open so that she had to lean across the seat and close it. She sat smiling as she watched him make his way across the pasture toward the opposite gate. He seemed to throw himself forward at each step, and then pull back as if he were calling on some power to witness that he was being forced. "Well," she said aloud as if he were still in the car, "it's your own boys who are making you do this, Mr. Greenleaf." O.T. and E.T. were probably splitting their sides laughing at him now. She could hear their identical nasal voices saying, "Made Daddy shoot our bull for us. Daddy won't know no better than to think that's a fine bull he's shooting. Gonna kill Daddy to shoot that bull." "If those boys cared a thing about you, Mr. Greenleaf," she said, "they would have come for that bull. I'm surprised at them." He was circling around to open the first gate. The bull, dark among the spotted cows, had not moved. He kept his head down, eating constantly. Mr. Greenleaf opened the gate and then began circling back to approach him from the rear. When he was about 10 feet behind him, he flapped his arms at his sides. The bull lifted his head indolently and then lowered it again and continued to eat. Mr. Greenleaf stooped again and picked up something and threw it at him with a vicious swing. She decided it was a sharp rock, for the bull leapt, and then began to gallop until he disappeared over the rim of the hill. Mr. Greenleaf followed at his leisure. "You needn't think you're going to lose him," she cried and started the car straight across the pasture. She had to drive slowly over the terraces, and when she reached the gate, Mr. Greenleaf and the bull were nowhere in sight. This pasture was smaller than the last, a green arena encircled almost entirely by woods. She got out and closed the gate and stood looking for some sign of Mr. Greenleaf, but he had disappeared completely. She knew at once that his plan was to lose the bull in the woods. Eventually, she would see him emerge somewhere from the circle of trees and come limping toward her, and when he finally reached her, he would say, "If you can find that gentleman in them woods, you're better'n me." She was going to say, "Mr. Greenleaf, if I have to walk into those woods with you and stay all afternoon, we are going to find that bull and shoot him. You are going to have to shoot him if I have to pull the trigger for you." And when he saw she meant business, he would return and shoot the bull quickly himself. She got back into the car and drove to the center of the pasture where he would not have to walk so far to reach her when he came out of the woods. At this moment, she could picture him sitting on a stump, making lines in the ground with a stick. She decided that she would wait exactly 10 minutes by her watch. Then she would begin to honk. She got out of the car and walked around a little and then sat down on the front bumper to wait and rest. She was very tired, and she lay her head back against the hood and closed her eyes. She did not understand why she should be so tired when it was only mid-morning. Through her closed eyes she could feel the sun red hot overhead. She opened her eyes slightly, but the white light forced her to close them again. For some time she lay back against the hood, wondering drowsily why she was so tired. With her eyes closed, she didn't think of time as divided into days and nights, but into past and future. She decided that she was tired because she had been working continuously for 15 years. She decided that she had every right to be tired, and to rest for just a few minutes before she began working again. Before any kind of judgment seat, she would be able to say, "I have worked, I have not wallowed." At this very instant, while she was recalling a lifetime of work, Mr. Greenleaf was loitering in the woods, and Mrs. Greenleaf was probably flat on the ground asleep over her hole full of clippings. The woman had got worse over the years, and Mrs. May believed that now she was actually demented. "I'm afraid your wife has let religion warp her," she said once tactfully to Mr. Greenleaf. "Everything in moderation, you know." "She cured a man once that half his guts was eat out with worms," Mr. Greenleaf said, and she had turned away half sickened. Poor souls, she thought now, so simple. For a few seconds, she dozed.
A Christian is supposed to be warped through their relationship with Jesus. If a human being is warped by anything other than that, it's not good. Mrs. May is warped. I love how Mrs. May is obviously omniscient. She knows everything that's happening in the woods. This isn't the first time she's exercised this power, although every time she's gotten it wrong. Oh, and she's going to rest for a few minutes before she begins to work again. You know what I'm going to say about that. This whole scene is what plays out on her farm every day. Mr. Greenleaf does everything. She sits around thinking that she's doing everything. And the sun is shining really bright. And the last thing, she doesn't believe in God. But if there is some sort of judgment seat before which she will stand, she's confident that she will measure up. Her idea is that the standard by which she will be judged is some form of works righteousness, with an extremely low bar, because she doesn't do any work.
When she sat up and looked at her watch, more than 10 minutes had passed. She had not heard any shot. A new thought occurred to her. Suppose Mr. Greenleaf had aroused the bull, chucking stones at him, and the animal had turned on him and run him up against a tree and gored him. The irony of it deepened. O.T. and E.T. would get a shyster lawyer and sue her. It would be a fitting end to her 15 years with the Greenleafs. She thought of it almost with pleasure, as if she had hit on the perfect ending for a story that she was telling her friends. Then she dropped it, for Mr. Greenleaf had a gun with him, and she had insurance. She decided to honk. She got up and reached inside the car window and gave 3 sustained honks, and 2 or 3 shorter ones to let him know that she was getting impatient. Then she went back and sat down on the bumper again. In a few minutes, something emerged from the tree line, a black heavy shadow that tossed its head several times and then bounded forward. After a second, she saw it was the bull. He was crossing the pasture toward her at a slow gallop. A gay, almost rocking gait, as if he were overjoyed to find her again. She looked beyond him to see if Mr. Greenleaf was coming out of the woods too, but he was not. "Here he is, Mr. Greenleaf," she called out, looking on the other side of the pasture to see if he could be coming out of there, but he was not in sight. She looked back and saw that the bull, his head lowered, was racing toward her. She remained perfectly still. Not in fright, but in a freezing disbelief. She stared at the violent black streak bounding toward her as if she had no sense of distance, as if she could not decide at once what his intention was. And the bull had buried his head in her lap, like a wild, tormented lover before her expression changed. One of his horns sank until it pierced her heart, and the other curved around her side and held her in an unbreakable grip. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky. And she had the look of a person whose sight has been suddenly restored, but who finds the light unbearable. Mr. Greenleaf was running toward her from the side with his gun raised, and she saw him coming, though she was not looking in his direction. She saw him approaching on the outside of some invisible circle, the tree line gaping behind him, and nothing under his feet. He shot the bull 4 times through the eye. She did not hear the shots, but she felt the quake in the huge body as it sank, pulling her forward on its head, so that she seemed, when Mr. Greenleaf reached her, to be bent over whispering some last discovery into the animal's ear.
Isn't that a great ending? So what happened? Mrs. May honks the horn and agitates the bull. He's got a thing for wrecking vehicles. Then we have this line. He was crossing the pasture toward her at a slow gallop. A gay, almost rocking gait, as if he were overjoyed to find her again. It's like one of those scenes in the old movies, where the lovers run at each other across the field in slow motion. This hooks into all that romantic stuff between Mrs. May and the bull in the first paragraphs of the story. Romeo and Juliet, Zeus in the form of a bull going after Europa, the uncouth country suitor. All this merges with the biblical idea of Jesus loving each individual personally, and the metaphor that calls the church the bride of Christ. She thought she was in control, that she could resist the will of Jesus. She thought that she could reject this suitor. So here he comes bounding across the field right at her. In freezing unbelief, she does not move. Her mind is unable to adapt to the reality that she has been denying all her life. Then we have more romantic, even sexual language, sort of mixed in with all the violence. The bull buried his head in her lap, like a wild, tormented lover. One of his horns pierced her heart. The other curved around her side. That's what happens when you are in love, right? Your heart is pierced? That's a very Cupid sort of a word. The other horn is part of an embrace. It's all very romantic. Then these words. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky. And she had the look of a person whose sight had been suddenly restored, but who finds the light unbearable. She now sees reality. Reality as it has always been. The trees never did hold off the sky. In a world that is nothing but sky, all of reality is under the sky's dominion. And it's really bright. Mr. Greenleaf arrives. She sees the sky beneath his feet. Makes sense with her new way of seeing things. And he shoots the bull 4 times. Most of the time the crucifixion is thought of as 5 wounds, but if you get rid of the Roman soldier's spear wound, which happens after Jesus died, it's 4. When Mr. Greenleaf gets close, it's like she was whispering a little secret into the bull's ear. That's what lovers always do. So it might have been a happy ending in this little tale of romance, but perhaps not. She saw, but it doesn't say anything about her repenting. But this is not the point of this story, and it's probably why we don't have a clear moment of redemption. This story is about a woman who had a mistaken view of reality. The story is not about her repentance and redemption, but maybe it's about ours. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.